last week's reading from Mark took us from one side of the two stories we're going to have today to the other, and talked about how the crowd came to Jesus en masse. Mark making it plain the 5,000 men who came, and hinted, as we spoke about last week, at the intent behind that gathering and what they wanted to do. This week our reading comes from John's Gospel, and it tells the story that came in between those two. So we have the filler in the sandwich, the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 men and Jesus walking on water. Jesus has just been talking with the religious authorities, and he's mentioning Moses and the fact that Moses had foretold his coming, and he accuses the religious leaders of not having listened to what Moses said, and hence not being able to understand what Jesus is talking about either. Since you do not believe what he wrote, meaning Moses, how can you believe what I say? And so our reading begins, chapter 6 in John's Gospel, verses 1 to 21. After this, Jesus went across Lake Galilee, or Lake Tiberias as it is also called. A large crowd followed him, because they had seen his miracles of healing and those who were ill. Jesus went up a hill and sat down with his disciples. The time for the Passover festival was near. Jesus looked round and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, so he asked Philip, "Where can we buy enough food to feed all these people?" He said this to test Philip, actually. He already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, "Well, for everyone to have even a little, it would take more than 200 silver coins to buy enough bread." Another of his disciples, Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother, said, "There is a boy here who has 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 fish, but they will certainly not be enough for all these people." "Make the people sit down," Jesus said. There was a lot of grass there. So all the people sat down. There were about 5,000 men. Jesus took the bread, gave thanks to God, and distributed it to the people who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, and they all had as much as they wanted. And when they were all full, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces left over. Let us not waste any." So they gathered them all up and filled 12 baskets with the pieces left over from the 5 barley loaves which the people had eaten. Seeing this miracle that Jesus had performed, the people there said, "Surely this is the prophet who was to come into the world." Jesus knew that they were about to come and seize him in order to make him king by force. So he went off to the hills by himself. When evening came, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake, got into a boat, and went back across the lake towards Capernaum. Night came on, and Jesus still had not come back to them. By then, a strong wind was blowing and stirring up the water. The disciples had rowed about 5 or 6 kilometers when they saw Jesus walking on the water, coming near the boat, and they were terrified. "Don't be afraid," Jesus told them. "It is I." Then they willingly took him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached land at the place where it was heading for. So 2 more nature miracles, as they would be in Mark's Gospel, told here in John, again with a real sense of Jesus being totally in control of what's happening here, and of every action being laden with a spiritual undertone, if you like. We get some extra details in the story here than we do in Mark's Gospel. Mark, you remember, said that he went with his disciples to a lonely place. The idea of a retreat. Let's get away from all this hubbub and mayhem of people trying to touch my cloak and be healed and crowding in around us for healing. Let's go somewhere lonely. But here, Jesus goes up a hill, and it's Passover festival time. Those are the 2 extraneous details we get. So, of course, having just talked about Moses, John is setting us up to hear again the fact that Jesus is about to do something like Moses and give the new people of Israel a new law. And that law, of course, is the spiritual feeding that he's about to undertake. For make no mistake, this is a spiritual feeding, not a physical feeding. When Jesus was talking in chapter 4 to the Samaritan woman at the well, he has a conversation with her that inspires her to go back to the village and tell all the people there that she's met the Messiah. So convinced is she by what Jesus has said to her. And the disciples come back. They've gone away into the town to get some food. And when the disciples come back and the woman has left, they say, in the meantime, the disciples were begging Jesus, "Teacher, have something to eat." And Jesus says, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." That makes them all start thinking, has he got a sandwich secured somewhere? But no, he is talking there and here when he asks Philip, where can we buy enough food to feed all these people? Yeah, where can you get enough food to feed all these people? Man, it would be a huge task. But we're not here to feed them physically, although that does happen, of course, in a miracle. We're here to teach them something new. We're here to teach them the kingdom of heaven is near and what that really means for them. Of course, throughout all of the story of the feeding of the 5,000 men, what we're told popularly happens, this won't be the case for every unique individual who was there, but the popular idea was that the men, so back to what Mark was saying last week, got the idea, well, this guy's great, let's make him king. And John explicitly explains that that's the reason why Jesus then went off by himself and why the disciples leave that place in the boat and go back to the other side, because there's this big crowd of people who are convinced that Jesus is going to do something for them that he really isn't all about, but they're focusing on their own agenda and what they want God to do, not listening to what God, who's actually in front of them, is telling them life is all about. And this is the real meat of all of our readings and our lessons, and what we can learn from this in the sense of how we pursue our own agendas so very often. The miracle of the actual feeding, of course, is laid on with a particular trowel, because we're told that obviously Philip comes up with one answer, which is inadequate. Andrew then at least manfully suggests that there could be some possible way with finding some small person who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. The barley loaves and 2 fish, so these are specifically the meanest, poorest, coarsest type of bread, the cheapest type of bread, and the fish described elsewhere as dried fish, so very poor again. So we're not talking here about a banquet by any means, we're talking about a really meagre packed lunch, and Jesus transforms that into something that is sufficient for all these people who are there. Very much a mustard seed analogy. And people are fed. And Jesus says to the disciples to gather up all the pieces that are left, and of course there are 12 baskets. So that magic number 12. So we've got a real sense of Moses here, teaching on a hill, providing for his people, creating a new Israel with new teaching. But what happens? Yep, the people try and force him to be king, so they go off to a lonely place. The walking on the water in John's Gospel is interesting and inspires much commentary, certainly around the fact that whether Jesus did or didn't walk on any water, because clearly if the disciples had got into a boat, they rowed that far, it was in a tempestuous storm, they didn't know where they were. The literal translation of they saw Jesus walking on the water is actually equally valid to say they saw Jesus walking by the water. So when Jesus gets into the boat and they've immediately landed, well, perhaps they were already there. It really doesn't matter, though, because they saw Jesus, they were scared, they got frightened, but they willingly took him into the boat. And what does Jesus say to them when he sees them? Don't be afraid, Jesus told them. In my translation here, the Good News Bible, it says, "It is I," but literally translated, "I am." So they're frightened. God appears, in this case in human form in Jesus, and says those words, "I am," which of course God spoke to Moses and was the way in which God was referred to in the Old Testament always, that most sacred of words, "I am." Don't put a label on me. Don't think I'm somebody you know. Don't think I'm something you know. I am. I exist. I am. And they willingly take him into the boat. And they find salvation in the form of physical safety. So we've got a whole bunch of people being physically, but more importantly, spiritually fed. And we've got a whole bunch of people being saved from their terror by the presence of God, who reassures them. So John really weaves these two stories into his whole narrative of how God in human form reveals himself to people and shows us what God is really like. And it's a God who teaches us to look beyond our own desires, our own expectations, tries to make us raise our head above the normal things of life and see what life is really all about, and the fact that every entrusted breath, every waking moment, literally is entrusted to us, given to us to do something good with, and to take God's love into our hearts and be transformed by it, and thereby share that love with other people, so that the kingdom of heaven may be made, not by people who force God to do things that they would like, and conquer and overrun and are overbearing to other people and enforce their will on them, but rather show them the light, rather show them something rather beautiful. So show them the true meaning of what it's like to be alive and in community, rather than be an oppressive force, yet another oppressive force. See how well that's worked out in history. Here, a binding, a unity of people with a common purpose, who understand that there is unity not through nationhood or through a shared king or through a physical place or through even a system of beliefs, but a unity that comes from knowing that we're all made by God and we're all loved by God. And that's the real message that Jesus wants everyone to hear in John's Gospel and throughout the world. Let us hope that we too can see Jesus in our fright, our terror, our fear, and in our distress, and willingly take God into our hearts, so that we too may know the love and the peace and the strength that God so desperately wants us to know.